This video is about how to submit a form using PyScript to Flask application and how to validate submitted data on Flask side. This video can be useful just because of data validation on Flask side. I will show how to write a custom validator to validate users' input and how to use it with a FlaskForm instance, how to pass CSRF token with request headers, how to configure Flask application to avoid circular imports. In this video, PyScript is responsible for sending AJAX POST-requests to Flask and for rendering a response from Flask. I am clicking on the Submit button and PyScript sends a POST request to my Flask application. Flask creates an instance of city model and sends back its object name. If I use non-letter characters in the city name, this name won't pass validation. I used here a server-side validation, and that's why the input field is colored in red after the click. And that's it. This example is very simple by its idea, but maybe a bit tricky in implementation. I have created templates folder that contains index template. It has two sections, one for a form and one to render cities. I don't use form tag here because the form tag is not required here. My form is pretty simple. It's just a div block with some bootstrap classes that contains a row with two columns. One column for an input field and one for a submit button. This layout allows me to keep the input field and the button on one row. Also, there is a div to render cities that PyScript will get from Flask. In the index template, I also have attached bootstrap. There is also the static folder that contains styles CSS with some CSS styles for list item tags. It's the regular bootstrap card CSS styles. And that's it. Now let's install Flask, Flask-WTF and Flask-SQLAlchemy. I use Poetry and made a video about it. The link will be in the description to the video. Now I want to configure my Flask application. So let's create a config py module that will contain the config class and application factory that will initialize Flask instance, and then let's configure it. First of all, I have to import the Flask class from the Flask module. Then let's create the config class. It will have the debug field for a while that will be set to true. Now I want to define the createApp function that will have the config object parameter with the config class as the default value. In the body of the createApp function, I want to define an instance of the Flask class, as usual. And then let's load the configuration of our app from the config class. We can do it with the fromObject method. It accepts the config object variable as an argument. This one. And the createApp function will return the app variable. Very simple, but this application factory allows us to avoid circular import problems that inevitably will appear when we will come to a module definition and creating an instance of SQLAlchemy class. And now let's create the main py module and import the createApp function. And let's get a Flask instance with it. To run the application, I have to use the if main block. Then we need a new view that will accept get and post requests. And let's render our index template as a response to a GET request. So we have to check if request method equals to GET, we can use the render template function to render the index template. And of course we have to import the request object and the render template function. And now we can test our project. Okay, it works. Now I want to create a model, create a table in a database, and create a form to use it for users' input validation. Let's start with the definition of database. I need the config.py module, and to use SQLAlchemy I have to add a new property to the config class. SQLAlchemy database URI in uppercase. And this variable will have the following value. First of all, I have to specify the database I will use. I want to use the SQLite database, colon and 3 slashes. Then I have to specify the name and location of the database I want to use. The SQLite database is just a file, and so I have to specify the absolute path to that file. To do it, we can use the same idea like in Django. First of all, let's import the path class from the pathlib module. Then I'm creating the base_dir variable, and it'll be an instance of the path class. And I'm passing into the path class the file variable. And now the base_dir variable is a path to the current config.py module. To get the path of the folder that contains this config.py module, I have to call the parent property. Okay, we got the base_dir variable, and now let's use it to get the absolute path to the database file by calling its joinPath method. And let's say that the name of the database will be db SQLite. And to perform the concatenation, I have to convert this path instance to string. Okay, the next step is to create a model that will represent a city in the database. Let's create the models module and import the SQLAlchemy class. Now I want to create an instance of the SQLAlchemy class that will be the db variable. After that, I have to describe these changes in the create_app function. I have to bind our instance of the Flask class with the instance of the SQLAlchemy class. So in the create_app function, I have to import the db variable. From models, import db. And I am calling the initApp method and passing into it the app variable. Okay, in the shell we can see the deprecation warning. Let's copy and paste this name here. And let's say it will be false. And now let's define a model in the models.py file. Let's create a new class, the city class, for example, that will represent our city in the database. It will be a subclass of the model class. And our city class will have only 2 fields. I want to have an ID for each city and a name. The ID property will be an instance of the column class, and its type will be integer, and it'll be a primary key. Then the name. It'll be a string. Now I have to define the init method that will get any positional and keyworded arguments. And now I have to call the init method of the parent class of our city model and pass into it the positional and the keyworded arguments. And also let's add the wrapper method to get readable description of instances in shell. Okay, now we need to create the table in the database and create a city object as a test. First of all, I have to import the DB object and the city model from the models module. To create the database file and the city table in the database, I have to call the createAll method. db createAll. And we got the exception that says that I'm trying to work outside the application context. To add the context, I have to import the app variable. From main import app. And then I have to call the app context and push methods. And after that, I can call the createAll method. We can see that the database was created. And now let's create a city object. City, the name will be Berlin. To save the city object to the database, I have to add this object to database session object. For more details, consider watching my Flask tutorials. db session, add C. And to write the city object to the database, I have to call the commit method of the session object. We got no exceptions, and we can see the ID of the city. And it means that the city object was written to the database successfully. So our model works, and the database also works. The next step is to create a form that I want to use to validate a user's input. Let's again configure our Flask app. First of all, I have to set a secret key. Usually it's a long random string that is used for CSRF tokens generation. Then I want to create a form I will use in the template to insert a CSRF token in it. And for validation, of course. So let's create the forms.py module. Forms.py. Let's import the FlaskForm class. Then let's define a new cityForm class. It will be a subclass of the FlaskForm. It will have only one field, the name field. It will be an instance of the string field class. To its init method, I want to pass a list of validators. Validator's parameter, it's a list. And now I want to define my custom validator that will raise the validation error exception if the name of a city will contain non-letter characters. So let's define a new function, the name validator, for example, that will accept two arguments, the form and the field. And then I want to check the city's name. It's stored in the field local variable. So if not field, I need the data attribute, it's a string, the name, and then I want to check if it's alpha or not. And then if the isAlpha method will return false, I want to raise the validation error exception with some message. Now let's import all these classes. Okay, the validator is ready. And now let's append it to the validator's list of the string field class. And that's it. And it's time to use this form. I need the main py module. And let's import the DB object, the city class and the cityForm class. So from models import DB and the city, and from forms import cityForm. And now in the index function I want to create an instance of the cityForm class if a user makes a GET request to the page. So the form variable will be an instance of the cityForm. and let's pass it to the template. And right away, let's use this form to get the CSRF token in the template. I need the template. Let's say that's somewhere here. And also, we have to configure CSRF protection for our Flask application. I need again the config py module, and here let's import the CSRF protect class. And in the create app function, I have to bind it with our Flask application. And I'm using again the needs app method. And this is an important detail. Without this configuration, Flask-WTF won't be able to read headers of a post request to get a CSRF token from it. So, okay, it was a GET request. And now let's write the handler of a POST request. And here I want to create an instance of the cityForm class again. Bound form will be cityForm, and its data parameter, I want to populate it with the data we will get from a POST request. As we are going to use PyScript to submit a form, we will send to Flask a JSON object, and so we can call the getJSON method of the request object. GetJSON. Okay, and now I want to check whether the submitted data in our bound form variable are valid or not. To do it, I want to call its validateOnSubmit methods. The validateOnSubmit method is a shortcut for forms isSubmitted and validate methods. The validateOnSubmit will return true if the form is submitted and if it's a valid form. If it is submitted and valid, I want to save a city object with the name a user inputted. So the city name variable will be bound form, and I need its name field and I need its data attribute. It's the same statement that we used in the name validator function. So then let's create a city object like we did in Python shell and save it. And at last I want to return the city object to PyScript frontend to render it to a user. We can do it using the JSONify function. Return JSONify. Let's import it from the Flask module. But I have to send to my PyScript frontend a JSON serializable object. That is, it should be a dictionary which represents a city object with all its attributes. And I think that the easiest way to serialize a city object, that is to convert them to dictionaries, is to use the data class decorator from the city module. So let's open the modules py and let's import the data class decorator. And let's decorate the city class with that data class. And now I want to define a set of attributes for the module. ID will be integer and name will be string. And that's it. And now city objects can be easily serialized to JSON format. Okay, if the bound form is not valid, I want to return to user serialized dictionary with the errors key, and the value of this key will be errors dictionary of the bound form variable. That's it. We have done the Flask part, and now the PyScript part. That will get an input from a user and send it to our Flask project via AJAX POST-request. And now I want to add a PyScript to the project. I need the PyScript.net website, I need the installation, this section. Here let's get the link to the script and let's paste it in the head tag. Okay, and now let's create a new Python file in the static folder. Let's say that'll be the script.py file. Then let's add this script.py file to the index template somewhere here before the closing body tag. To add it, I have to use the PyScript tag, and its source attribute should be the path to the script.py file. To generate a link to the script.py module, I want to use the URL for function. Its first argument is the static, and its file name keyworded argument will be the script.py. And the same way I want to attach the styles CSS file in the head tag. Cannot import name string field. I forgot to import classes in the forms.py module. I didn't forgot, but I was wrong. I need WT forms. This way. Okay. PyScript is loading. So, submitting a form with a PyScript or with a JavaScript means that when a user clicks on the submit button, we have to get the value of the input field and send it to our Flask application. To do it, first of all, we have to set a click handler on the submit button. So first of all, let's add to the button an ID attribute. ID will be just button. Then the onClick handler will be defined in the script.py module. Let's create a new function, the submit form, for example, that will take an event from the browser as an argument. Pass for a while. This submit form function is the handler that will be called when a user clicks the submit button. Now I have to set an event listener to the button. So let's create the main function. Let's call it right away. And here in the body of the main function, let's get the button by its ID. I am using the getElementsById function, and the ID is the button. And to set a listener on it, we have to use the addEventListener method. As the first argument, it gets the event, the click, and the second argument is the result of the createProxy function from PyOdide module. We have to create proxy objects of our functions so JavaScript can use them as callbacks. And as an argument, I am passing the submit form function as an object. I don't call it. And let's import the PyOdide module. And now let's back to the submit form. I want to describe here the actions that will be performed when a user will click the button. First of all, I have to get the value of the input field and pass this value to our Flask application as a body of a post request. Then, after Flask will respond, I want to show a user the result of this response. The first step is to get the input field, to read a user's input. To identify the input tag from other tags, we can use the ID attribute again. So input will have the city input ID. And to get the input tag, we can use the query selector function this time. The hashtag means ID, city input. We got the input field as an element, and I want to get its value and save it to a city variable. Okay, we got the city name that a user inputted, and now I want to create a body for a post request. It will be a dictionary with the name key, and the value of the name key will be the city variable. The key of the dictionary should match to the name of the field in our Flask model, and the field in FlaskForm class too. It's an important detail. It's the name key because I used the name field for the city model. And the body of a post request should be serialized to JSON format. So let's wrap this dictionary with a JSON dumps function call. And let's import the JSON module. Okay, we got the body, and now let's make a post request. To make requests to Flask app, I want to use a separate function. Let's say it'll be the make request function. Let's call it. This function will take the URL, method, and the body as an argument. So the URL will be root, method will be post, and the body will be body. Now I want to save the response from Flask to the response variable. The makeRequest function will use a PyFetch function, that is a wrapper over JavaScript fetch function. And the fetch function is an asynchronous function. And calls of asynchronous functions should be performed using the await keyword. And accordingly, the submit form should be async. And now let's create the makeRequest function. Def makeRequest, and it should take 3 arguments: URL, method, and body. This function I want to use to send post requests only. As you probably know, post request should contain a body, and we have to use a CSRF protection by using CSRF tokens. This function will get a body from its call, and I have to get CSRF token and pass it with the post request. Now let's get a CSRF token. To get its value, let's get the input tag with a CSRF token ID. This input tag will be inserted by CSRF token attribute of the form. And let's get its value attribute. And now we have to pass this token to Flask, and I prefer to do it via requests or headers. Let's define the headers variable. It'll be a dictionary. And so I want to use the X requested with content type, headers, and the XCSRF token. And the XCSRF token header will get the CSRF variable as the value. This one. Then I'm going to send a request to my Flask application with the PyFetch function. PyFetch is a wrapper for JavaScript fetch function, and so it uses the same API. Await, because I'm calling the asynchronous function. And accordingly, the makeRequest function should be asynchronous. And let's import the PyFetch function. Okay. And now let's make a request to our Flask app with the PyFetch. The URL will be URL. And the returning value will be just a response JSON. This function will just make a post request to our Flask application and return some response from it. Let's back to the submit form function. We sent a post request with the PyScript. We got some data from Flask. The response from Flask will contain either an errors dictionary or the name of the submitted city. So now I want to check if the response has errors. If response gets, I'm trying to get the errors, and if the response has errors, I want to add to city input element the bootstrap is invalid CSS class. We can do it by using the add method of the class last attribute. City input, the element is invalid. Otherwise, first of all, I want to change CSS classes for city input tag. Again, city input. But this time I want to override the value of the class attribute using the class last attribute. So the new value of the class attribute will be from control. Then I want to get the UL tag with the city's ID. This tag. Let's create a last item tag. Its text will be the city name that we will get from Flask. And let's append this last item tag to the UL tag, last item. Let's test it. If you like this video about how to submit a form with PyScript and validate this submitted form on Flask side, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching.